What happened to every Mafia boss who testified against John Gotti? There is a version of this story that almost everyone has heard. It shows up in documentaries, in online threads, in conversations between people who think they know how organized crime works. According to that version, the most powerful Mafia boss in America was brought down by a wave of betrayal from the top. Multiple bosses, multiple testimonies, a collapse of loyalty so total that the man at the center never stood a chance. That version is wrong. The verified record tells a different story, one that is smaller in scale but far more significant in what it reveals. What actually happened, who actually testified, and what became of them afterward does not match the narrative that most people have accepted as fact. The gap between the popular account and the documented truth is wide, and the real story is more consequential than the myth it replaced. Today, we are covering what happened to every Mafia boss who testified against John Gotti. What you are about to hear will challenge what you think you know about his downfall, correct a misconception that has been repeated for decades, and follow the consequences to a place most retellings never reach. Part 1. The Untouchable King. On the evening of December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car in front of Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan. He was 69 years old, the reigning boss of the Gambino crime family, and he was there for a dinner meeting. He never made it to the door. 4 men in long trench coats and fur hats were waiting on the sidewalk. They opened fire at close range. Castellano was hit 6 times. His driver, Thomas Bellotti, was gunned down beside him. Both men lay on the pavement, in full view of the rush-hour crowd moving through Midtown. Across the street, sitting in a car with a clear line of sight to the restaurant entrance, was John Gotti. He had orchestrated the entire operation. The men who pulled the triggers were members of his crew. The timing, the location, the operation, all of it was planned under Gotti's direction. Within hours, he would begin consolidating control of the Gambino family. Within days, he would assume the position of boss. He was 45 years old, and he had just forced his way to the top of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. The killing of a sitting boss was, within the Mafia's own rules, one of the most dangerous moves a member could make. The Commission, the governing body that coordinated between the 5 New York families, generally had to approve or at least tolerate leadership changes. Unauthorized hits on a boss could trigger retaliation from other families or organized resistance from within the victim's own organization. The fact that Gotti executed the Castellano killing and assumed control without facing serious opposition spoke to both his planning and his willingness to take risks that other members of the organization would have considered suicidal. The old boss was still lying on a Manhattan sidewalk when the new one started taking over. What followed was unlike anything the American Mafia had seen before. Previous bosses had operated in secrecy. They avoided cameras. They used intermediaries to insulate themselves from criminal activity. They dressed modestly, kept their names out of the press, and treated invisibility as a survival tool. Gotti rejected all of it. He appeared in tailored suits that cost thousands of dollars. He attended high-profile social events. He walked the streets of his Howard Beach neighborhood in Queens like a local celebrity, shaking hands and posing for photographs. He conducted business openly at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, arriving and departing at predictable times in full view of anyone watching, including federal agents. Once in power, Gotti moved to consolidate his authority with a speed that left no room for challenge. He surrounded himself with loyalists, men who had participated in the Castellano plot, or who had supported his rise from the beginning. He restructured the family's operations to ensure his closest allies held the most critical positions. The result was a leadership circle tightly aligned around Gotti personally, with the boss at the center of every major decision and every significant criminal enterprise the family controlled. That consolidation meant Gotti was personally connected to an unusually wide range of criminal activity. Unlike bosses who maintained layers of deniability between themselves and the acts committed on their behalf, Gotti was directly involved in discussions about enforcement, extortion, and other crimes. He gave orders in person. He discussed operational details openly. This hands-on approach gave him control, but it also created a trail of exposure that a more cautious leader would have avoided. The Mafia's power had always depended on secrecy. Gotti was building his on attention, and for a time that strategy appeared to work. Across the late 1980s, the federal government brought 3 separate major cases against him: racketeering charges, assault charges, conspiracy allegations. Each time, the prosecution failed to secure a conviction. Gotti walked out of the courthouse 3 times, free, while the cameras captured every step. Each acquittal became a public event. Each one reinforced the image of a man who could not be brought down. The media gave him a name for it. They called him the Teflon Don, because nothing the government threw at him seemed to stick. That name became more than a nickname. It became a narrative. Each acquittal increased Gotti's earning power. Construction firms, union officials, and business owners who had been considering cutting ties with the Gambino family saw the courtroom results and stayed in line. The message was clear. This boss could not be removed through legal channels, which meant his authority over every racket and revenue stream the family controlled was effectively unchallenged. 3 federal trials, 3 acquittals. Inside the Mafia, Gotti's survival felt like proof that the system was unbreakable. Each acquittal compounded not just Gotti's reputation, but his practical power. Captains who might have questioned his leadership after the Castellano hit now had no leverage. Associates who feared the family's exposure to federal prosecution saw a boss who kept beating the charges. Gotti's courtroom record became a management tool, proof, delivered in public and on camera, that following him was the safest bet in organized crime. A single acquittal could be explained by prosecutorial weakness. 2 suggested a pattern. 3 created a mythology. That mythology was the most dangerous thing Gotti built, more dangerous than any criminal enterprise, more fragile than any alliance. Because it depended on a single assumption, that every member, regardless of pressure, would choose silence. If that assumption held universally, the system was impenetrable. If it failed once, at a high enough level, the entire structure was exposed. And the assumption was already being tested, not in a courtroom, not in a police interrogation room, in the very building where Gotti felt most secure. The gap between what Gotti believed about his own safety and what was actually happening inside the walls of the Ravenite Social Club was widening every week. He saw a headquarters. The FBI saw a recording studio. He saw trusted associates. Federal agents saw future evidence. The man who believed he was untouchable was generating the material that would be used to touch him. The agents who had failed 3 times knew the problem was not effort. It was evidence type. Juries had heard from lower-level informants and found their testimony unconvincing. They had seen surveillance photos that proved proximity, but not intent. They had reviewed financial documents that required expert interpretation most jurors could not follow. Each trial had taught the FBI what did not work against Gotti specifically. The 4th approach would have to be fundamentally different. The FBI had lost 3 times in court. They changed their entire approach for the 4th. The Ravenite Social Club presented a specific technical challenge. Gotti used it on a predictable schedule, which made it an obvious target, but the building was in a dense urban neighborhood where installing surveillance equipment required careful timing and cover. The FBI placed wiretaps inside the club and in an apartment located directly above it. Getting the equipment in without alerting anyone in Gotti's circle took months of preparation. The agents involved knew that if the operation was detected, Gotti would simply move his meetings elsewhere, and the opportunity would be gone. The new strategy targeted the Ravenite Social Club directly. FBI agents placed wiretaps inside the club and in an apartment located directly above it. The technical operation required patience, precision, and time. For months, recording devices captured conversations that Gotti never knew were being monitored. Every session was cataloged. Every conversation was transcribed. Every piece of potentially incriminating material was flagged for prosecutorial review. For months, recording devices captured conversations that Gotti never knew were being monitored. Every session was cataloged. Every conversation was transcribed. The tapes captured more than criminal directives. They captured Gotti's personality, his impatience with subordinates, his contempt for people he considered weak, his habit of assigning blame when operations went wrong. The recordings painted a portrait of a leader who demanded total loyalty from everyone around him, but extended very little of it in return. On those tapes, Gotti was heard openly discussing taking lives. He described criminal operations with a level of specificity that no previous prosecution had been able to establish. He gave orders. He assigned blame. He spoke freely about harmful acts, believing that the walls of the Ravenite protected him from outside ears. They did not. But the most consequential words captured on those recordings were not about criminal operations or plans to eliminate people. They were about one specific person, someone who was sitting in that same room, listening to the same conversations and hearing his own boss place blame directly on him. In several of those recorded conversations, Gotti criticized his own underboss. He blamed him for problems within the family. He attributed specific decisions and specific criminal acts to this man, by name. The nature of the comments went beyond frustration or routine criticism. Gotti was directing responsibility toward his number two in conversations that now existed on tape, in federal custody, available for any future prosecution the government chose to bring. Gotti's world still looked intact. He still commanded the Gambino family. He still had his acquittals, his reputation, and his confidence. But something had already shifted underneath him. He simply did not know it yet. The man sitting next to him did. Gotti believed the walls of the Ravenite protected him, but the man who would destroy everything he built was not on the other side of those walls. He was sitting at the same table, hearing his own name on every tape. Part 2. The man who realized he was dead. Salvatore Gravano had spent his entire adult life inside the Gambino crime family. He had entered the organization as a young man, worked his way through the ranks, and by the mid-1980s had established himself as one of the most capable and trusted figures in the family's hierarchy. He was known within the Mafia by a nickname, Sammy the Bull, and by a reputation for directness, operational competence, and a willingness to act when the family required it. Gravano's rise through the Gambino family had been built on two qualities that the organization valued above almost everything else: reliability and results. He handled assignments effectively. He managed operations without creating problems that required intervention from above. He earned money for the family consistently. In an organization where incompetence or disloyalty could result in death, Gravano's track record made him one of the most valuable people in the entire structure. By the time Gotti needed a co-conspirator for the Castellano plot, Gravano had already established himself as someone who could be trusted with the family's most dangerous operations. In 1985, Gravano was directly involved in the conspiracy to kill Paul Castellano. He was part of the inner circle that planned the operation and supported Gotti's takeover. That involvement was not peripheral. It was central, and it gave Gravano a standing within the new leadership that few underbosses had ever carried. He had not simply been promoted into the number 2 position. He had helped create it by removing the man who held the number 1 position before Gotti. Gotti appointed Gravano as underboss in 1986. The role placed Gravano at the operational center of the family. He relayed orders from the boss to the captains. He managed disputes between crews. He oversaw specific business operations and served as the day-to-day administrator of the family, while Gotti focused on broader decisions. In practical terms, the underboss knew everything. He was privy to the full scope of the family's criminal enterprise, from individual harmful acts to the financial networks that sustained the entire operation. Gravano did not just work for Gotti. He helped build everything Gotti controlled. For several years, the arrangement functioned the way it was supposed to. The boss led, the underboss administered. Loyalty between the two men appeared mutual. Gotti trusted Gravano with the family's most sensitive matters. Gravano trusted that his service and loyalty would be reciprocated, that the boss would protect him the way the code required. From the outside, and from within the family's lower ranks, the partnership appeared stable. The boss and the underboss presented a unified front. Decisions were communicated smoothly through the hierarchy. Revenue was generated consistently. Disputes were resolved. The Gambino family, under Gotti and Gravano's combined leadership, operated as a functioning criminal enterprise at the height of its influence. No one below them had reason to suspect that the relationship between the two most powerful men in the organization would become the fault line that destroyed everything. That arrangement defined Gravano's daily existence. He managed disputes between captains. He oversaw revenue-generating operations. He served as the point of contact between Gotti and the family's lower ranks. When a decision needed to be made and the boss was unavailable, Gravano made it. When a problem arose within the organization, Gravano handled it. He was not a figurehead. He was the operational engine of the Gambino family, the person who kept the organization functioning on a day-to-day basis, while the boss focused on the broader picture. That trust depended on a basic premise, that what was good for one was good for the other. In the Mafia's structure, the underboss pledged loyalty to the boss. In return, the boss was expected to shield the underboss from threats, both external and internal. When that reciprocity held, the partnership worked. When it broke down, the relationship became the most dangerous one in the organization. Gravano learned what the tapes contained. The specifics of how that information reached him are tied to the broader mechanics of the federal case. Attorneys sharing discovery materials, intermediaries passing word through the legal process. However the details arrived, the substance was unmistakable. His own boss, in his own voice, was directing blame for specific criminal acts toward Gravano by name. This was not gossip or rumor. This was recorded evidence in federal custody. On tape, in his own voice, the boss had built a case against the man sitting next to him. The recognition changed how Gravano experienced every subsequent interaction with Gotti. Meetings at the Ravenite that had once been routine now carried a different weight. Every conversation in which Gotti discussed the family's legal exposure became a potential data point on a future indictment, not of the boss, but of the underboss. Gravano was still performing the same duties, still managing the same operations, but he was now doing so with the knowledge that the man he served had quietly redirected the legal risk onto him. The fracture was not a single moment. It was a recognition that arrived and then deepened with every recorded conversation Gravano learned about. Each tape that contained Gotti blaming him for another problem, attributing another decision to him, directing another piece of responsibility in his direction. Each one closed off another escape route. The recordings were not going to disappear. They existed in federal custody, preserved permanently, available for use in any future proceeding the government chose to bring. Gravano's options collapsed quickly once he understood the full scope of what the tapes contained. If Gotti went to trial and won again, the recordings would still exist. They would remain available for a future prosecution of Gravano himself. Federal investigators do not discard evidence. What they cannot use in one case, they store for the next. Gravano's name, attached to specific criminal acts in Gotti's own voice, would sit in the government's files indefinitely, a weapon that could be used at any time. If Gotti went to trial and lost, the situation was worse. The government would possess recordings in which the boss of the Gambino family directly attributed serious criminal acts to his own underboss. Those recordings would become the foundation for a separate case against Gravano. A conviction on those charges would almost certainly mean life in prison. Either way, silence led to the same destination. The Code of Omerta, the oath Gravano had sworn and upheld for decades, now meant accepting the certainty of personal destruction. Loyalty to Gotti had become a one-way arrangement. Gravano had risked his life to help Gotti seize power. He had participated in the removal of Paul Castellano. He had carried out extreme actions on behalf of the family, and through his own recorded words, Gotti had turned all of that service into a weapon aimed directly at the man who had provided it. For the first time in his career, loyalty was not a shield. It was a trap. Making contact with the government was itself a risk. If anyone within the Gambino family learned that Gravano was even considering cooperation, he would not survive long enough to testify. The initial conversations between Gravano and federal authorities had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, through legal channels that could be trusted not to leak. Every step of the process carried the possibility of exposure, and exposure meant a guaranteed death sentence. Not from the courts, but from the organization he was preparing to betray. The internal logic of the decision, however, was ultimately binary. Remaining silent meant going to trial alongside Gotti, with the FBI's wiretap recordings serving as the central evidence against both of them. Given the content of those recordings, including Gotti's own words placing blame on Gravano, the likelihood of conviction was substantial. A conviction on the charges Gravano faced would almost certainly result in a life sentence. He would die in a federal prison, serving time for crimes his own boss had attributed to him on tape. Cooperation, on the other hand, meant violating the oath of omerta. It meant accepting permanent status as a traitor within the Mafia world. It meant providing detailed testimony about his own criminal history, including 19 acts of taking a life, all of which would become part of the public record. There was no version of cooperation that allowed Gravano to maintain his reputation, his relationships, or his identity as he had known it. Both paths led to the destruction of the life he had built. The only question was, which form that destruction would take. But the alternative was life in a federal prison for crimes his own boss had attributed to him on tape. In 1991, Salvatore Gravano made his decision. He agreed to cooperate with the federal government. He agreed to testify against John Gotti. And as part of that agreement, he provided a full accounting of his own criminal history. That history included involvement in 19 murders, 19 lives taken. Gravano admitted to every one of them. He was not a low-level associate offering fragments of information. He was the underboss of the Gambino crime family, the second most powerful figure in the organization, and he was offering to expose its operations from the inside out. No informant in the history of the American Mafia had ever provided this level of detail from this position of authority. Gravano knew the structure, the finances, the relationships between families, and the specific criminal acts committed under Gotti's leadership. His knowledge was not secondhand. It was direct, comprehensive, and devastating. What the government needed from Gravano was not simply confirmation of what the tapes already contained. The recordings captured fragments, conversations without full context, references to events that only insiders could decode, code language that required interpretation. Gravano could supply what the tapes could not. The chain of command behind each recorded conversation, the identities behind nicknames, the outcomes of orders that were given on tape but carried out off it. He was the key that made the recordings legible. The government moved quickly to formalize the agreement. The terms would be debated for years afterward, but in the moment, the priority was singular. Gravano's testimony could accomplish what 3 previous trials had failed to do. The code of omerta was not being broken by a peripheral figure. It was being broken by the underboss. The crack ran straight through the center of the organization. What followed would take place in a federal courtroom, and nothing about the Mafia would be the same afterward. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into cases that most channels won't cover with this level of detail. Gravano's decision to flip was devastating enough on its own, but what made it fatal for Gotti was what happened when that decision met a courtroom full of evidence that confirmed every word. Part 3. The trial that shattered the Mafia. The federal trial of John Gotti began in 1992 in a Brooklyn courthouse. This time, the government had something it had never possessed in any of the 3 previous cases against Gotti: wiretap recordings of the boss himself, combined with a cooperating witness from the highest level of his own organization. The wiretaps provided Gotti's voice. The witness could explain what those words meant. Together, the 2 forms of evidence created a case that was qualitatively different from anything the prosecution had brought to court before. The government took measures to protect the process before the trial even started. In previous Gotti cases, there had been concerns about jury tampering. One of his earlier acquittals had been linked to allegations that a juror had been bribed. For the 1992 trial, the jury was anonymous. Jurors' identities were sealed. They were sequestered for the duration of the proceedings, isolated from outside contact. The government was not going to risk interference a 4th time. Anonymous jurors, sealed identities. The government had closed every loophole Gotti had used before. Salvatore Gravano took the stand as a government witness. He was calm. He was organized. He did not present himself as a reluctant participant or a man seeking sympathy. He laid out the internal structure of the Gambino crime family with the precision of someone who had operated at its highest levels for years, because he had. He explained how the family was organized, how decisions moved from the boss to the captains to the soldiers, how orders were given, how money flowed, how eliminations were authorized. In previous Mafia trials, prosecutors had been forced to rely on law enforcement experts who studied organized crime from the outside, interpreting surveillance photographs and financial records for the jury. Gravano reversed that approach entirely. He was not an outside analyst describing what the Mafia looked like from a distance. He was an insider describing what it looked like from the center. He could explain not just what had happened, but why. The reasoning behind decisions, the internal politics that drove them, the consequences that followed. For the first time, a federal jury heard how the Mafia actually worked from someone who had helped run it. Gravano's testimony directly implicated Gotti in the elimination of Paul Castellano. He described the conspiracy in detail. He confirmed his own role. He confirmed Gotti's role as the architect of the plot. For years, investigators had suspected Gotti was behind what happened to Castellano. Gravano's testimony established it as fact, from the mouth of a man who was there when the plan was made. The specificity of Gravano's account was what made it so damaging. He did not offer vague impressions or second-hand knowledge. He described who was present when the decision was made, what roles were assigned, how the logistics were arranged, and what happened in the hours and days that followed. He placed Gotti at the center of the conspiracy, not through inference, but through direct, first-hand observation. For a jury hearing this testimony alongside wiretap recordings of Gotti discussing other criminal acts, the picture was becoming impossible to dismiss. That testimony mattered for a specific legal reason. The prosecution was building its case under the RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Under RICO, the government did not need to prove Gotti had personally committed every criminal act. They needed to prove he led and directed a criminal enterprise. The Castellano murder established the foundation of Gotti's power. Gravano's account of the racketeering conspiracy connected that foundation to every criminal operation the family had conducted since. The RICO framework allowed the prosecution to present the Gambino family not as a collection of individual crimes, but as a single, coordinated criminal enterprise directed from the top. Gravano's testimony was the thread that connected the individual acts to the enterprise. He could explain how a specific order from Gotti led to a specific criminal act, how the proceeds were distributed, and how the family's hierarchy ensured that the boss maintained control while insulating himself from direct participation. Without Gravano, the prosecution would have had to build those connections through inference and expert testimony. With Gravano, the connections were explicit. The jury did not have to guess at how the organization worked. They were told by someone who had operated it. The prosecution layered Gravano's testimony over the wiretap recordings from the Ravenite Social Club. On the tapes, Gotti's own voice discussed criminal matters. On the stand, Gravano explained what those discussions meant, who was involved, and what actions followed. Each piece of evidence reinforced the other. The tapes provided the words. Gravano provided the context. Together, they formed something the defense had no effective answer for. The effect in the courtroom was methodical. The prosecution would play a tape. Jurors would hear Gotti's voice, sometimes unclear, sometimes using coded language, sometimes referencing people and events by shorthand. Then Gravano would take the stand and decode it. Who Gotti was talking about, what the coded terms meant, what decision was being made, and what happened afterward. The recordings were no longer fragments. They were fully narrated evidence. Each tape played in court became a chapter, and Gravano was the narrator who made every chapter legible. The tapes were damaging. With Gravano explaining them, they were devastating. Defense attorneys tried to attack Gravano's credibility. They emphasized his criminal record, 19 homicides. They argued he was testifying solely to save himself from a life sentence. The argument had a surface logic. A man willing to admit to 19 acts of lethal violence might say anything to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison. The defense worked to paint Gravano as a self-serving liar, someone whose testimony was purchased through the promise of leniency and was therefore unreliable. The prosecution anticipated this. They did not present Gravano as a sympathetic figure. They presented him as an insider, whose knowledge was valuable precisely because of his position within the organization. His credibility did not rest on his character. It rested on the fact that his account was independently supported by the wiretap recordings. Where his testimony aligned with the tapes, his credibility was reinforced. Where the tapes provided context for his descriptions, the testimony became more persuasive. Two independent sources confirming each other. The defense could attack Gravano's motives, but they could not explain why his account so consistently matched the recordings. The defense had no equivalent rebuttal. In earlier cases, creating reasonable doubt had been enough. Against a case built on the defendant's own voice, confirmed by his own underboss, reasonable doubt was nearly impossible to manufacture. The jury, sequestered for weeks, isolated from families and jobs, was processing an enormous volume of evidence, tapes, testimony, documents, all pointing in the same direction. The weight of it was cumulative, and by the trial's final weeks, overwhelming. The trial lasted several weeks. Throughout its duration, the prosecution maintained its methodical approach, building each element of the case on the foundation of documentary evidence, electronic surveillance, and insider testimony. Gravano was not the only witness called by the government, but he was the most important. His testimony anchored the prosecution's narrative and gave the jury a framework for understanding every other piece of evidence presented. On April 2, 1992, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty on all counts. Murder, conspiracy to commit homicide, racketeering, obstruction of justice, illegal gambling, loan sharking, tax evasion. Every charge the government brought was sustained. No partial verdicts, no reduced charges, no acquittals on individual counts. The sentence was life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had beaten the government 3 times would never see freedom again. Inside the Gambino family, the conviction created a vacuum that had no precedent. The boss was gone. The underboss had been the one to put him there. The family's 2 most senior leaders were removed simultaneously, one to prison, the other to federal protection. No family in the modern history of the American Mafia had ever lost both its top figures to the same case. The organizational structure that Gotti had built, with himself at the center of every decision, now had no center at all. Outside the Gambino family, the verdict carried a message that reached every corner of organized crime in the country. The federal government had found a way through. The combination of electronic surveillance and insider testimony had accomplished what decades of conventional investigation had not. Every boss in every family understood what the verdict meant for their own organizations. If the underboss of the Gambino family could flip and bring down the most powerful boss in the country, then the same thing could happen to any of them. The rules had changed. And unlike the temporary setbacks the Mafia had experienced in previous decades, this change could not be walked back. The precedent was established. The template was proven. The method worked. The Teflon Don myth died in that courtroom. The trial was over. The verdict was final. But what happened to the man who made it all possible was a story the courtroom could not contain. The trial ended Gotti's freedom forever, but for the man who put him there, the real question was just beginning. What does the government do with someone who admitted to 19 homicides and delivered the most important testimony in Mafia history? Part 4. What happened to the traitor? Salvatore Gravano had delivered the single most consequential piece of testimony in the history of American organized crime prosecution. He had dismantled the Teflon Don image. He had exposed the Gambino family's internal operations. He had sent John Gotti to prison for life. Now, the federal government had to decide what to do with the man who had made all of that possible. The answer was a 5-year prison sentence. Despite the scale of what Gravano had admitted to, he received a term shorter than many individuals convicted of non-violent offenses. The disparity was enormous, and it reflected the value the government placed on his cooperation. Prosecutors argued that without Gravano's testimony, the conviction of John Gotti would not have happened. The court agreed. The cooperation was unprecedented. The reduction in punishment was equally unprecedented. The 5-year sentence raised questions that extended far beyond Gravano's individual case. The entire framework of federal witness cooperation depended on offering meaningful incentives to individuals who possessed critical information. Without the promise of a reduced sentence, high-ranking criminal figures would have no reason to provide testimony. The system required leniency as currency. But the specific terms of Gravano's deal meant that a man who had admitted to participating in 19 acts of lethal violence was serving less time than many people convicted of non-violent offenses. The practical justification was clear. Gravano's testimony enabled the prosecution of a criminal enterprise that would otherwise have remained intact. The moral complexity of that exchange was equally clear. 19 admitted homicides, 5 years in prison. That was the price of bringing down John Gotti. Gravano served his sentence and entered the Witness Security Program, WITSEC, run by the United States Marshals Service. The program provided him with a new identity and relocated him to Arizona, far from every connection he had in New York. For a man who had testified against the most powerful mafia boss in the country, the threat of retaliation was not theoretical. Members of the Gambino family and associates across other organized crime groups had every reason to want him dead. The Marshals Service was tasked with making sure that did not happen. The Witness Security Program had been operating since the early 1970s. By the time Gravano entered it, the program had relocated thousands of witnesses and their families. The basic structure involved providing a new identity, relocation to an area where the witness had no prior connections, and ongoing support to help the witness establish a new life. The program was designed to make the witness effectively invisible, removed from any environment where they might be recognized or tracked. For a time, the arrangement worked. Gravano was living under a new name, in a new state, separated from the world he had inhabited for decades. The government had kept its end of the deal. Gravano had kept his. The expectation was that he would disappear into civilian life and stay there. He did not. The government gave him a new name, a new home, and a second chance. He used it to build another criminal operation. Gravano left the Witness Security Program. The transition to a lawful civilian existence for a man who had spent his entire adult life inside a criminal organization required a fundamental change in behavior, social patterns, and daily habits. For someone whose identity, income, social network, and daily routine had all been defined by the Mafia for decades, the shift to conventional life was not simply a matter of a new name and a new city. It required abandoning the only skill set, the only relationships, and the only way of operating Gravano had ever known. That transition failed completely. In the year 2000, federal and state authorities arrested Gravano in Arizona for running an substance distribution operation. The charges described an organized distribution network, moving large quantities of the controlled substance through the Phoenix area. Multiple participants, established distribution channels, substantial volumes. The arrest drew national attention. The story of the highest-ranking mafia cooperator in American history, returning to crime within a few years of his release, was extraordinary by any standard. It called into question the judgment of the prosecutors who had offered him such a favorable deal. It raised doubts about the WITSEC program's ability to rehabilitate individuals with lifelong criminal patterns. And it generated a renewed public debate about the ethics of cooperation agreements that offered extreme leniency to individuals responsible for taking lives. The operation itself revealed something about Gravano that his cooperation deal had not erased. Even outside the Mafia, even without the infrastructure of a crime family, he had organized a business that relied on the same principles he had used inside the Gambino family: hierarchy, distribution networks, management of people. The skills transferred. The protection did not. Without the Mafia's structure to insulate him, Gravano was exposed in a way he had never been as underboss. The organization that had once shielded its members from detection could not shield a man who was no longer a member. In 2002, Gravano was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the substance distribution charges. 20 years for substance distribution. 5 years for 19 homicides. The man who had helped bring down the Teflon Don was now serving a longer sentence for substance distribution than he had served for nearly 2 decades of harm. The disparity exposed a vulnerability in the federal cooperation framework that prosecutors had not anticipated. The government had staked its credibility on Gravano, presenting him to a jury as a witness whose testimony should be believed, despite his record. When that same witness returned to criminal activity within years of his release, it gave defense attorneys in future cooperation cases a powerful argument that the government's star witnesses were not reformed. They were simply criminals who had traded information for freedom and would offend again the moment they could. 20 years for distribution. 5 years for 19 acts of lethal violence. The numbers told their own story. Gravano served his time and was released in 2017. His re-entry into public life was not quiet. In the years following his release, he appeared in interviews and media productions, discussing his mafia career, his decision to cooperate, and his return to crime. He spoke openly about events that had once been protected by the most rigidly enforced oath in organized crime. He became a public figure again, though in a fundamentally different context, no longer a powerful underboss operating in secrecy, but a former convict recounting a life that had moved through extraordinary extremes. The interviews and media appearances placed Gravano in a position that no previous mafia cooperator of his rank had occupied. He was publicly discussing, in his own words, the internal workings of an organization that had ended lives for far less. He described the lives he had taken. He described the decision-making process inside the Gambino family. He described his relationship with Gotti and the moment that relationship collapsed. The man who had broken the most sacred oath in organized crime was now breaking it again, this time for cameras instead of courtrooms. The controversy surrounding Gravano has never faded. His cooperation made possible the most significant organized crime conviction in American history. His return to crime demonstrated the limits of the federal cooperation system. His case raised questions that the justice system still has not fully answered about the ethics of leniency for taking lives, about the effectiveness of witness protection for individuals with lifelong criminal patterns, and about the price society is willing to pay for the testimony that brings down the most dangerous organizations. Salvatore Gravano remains one of the most controversial cooperating witnesses in United States history. He broke the Mafia's most sacred oath at the highest level it had ever been broken. He received extraordinary leniency for extraordinary harm. And when the government gave him every tool to leave the criminal world behind, he returned to it within years. The man who shattered Omerta never fully escaped what it was built to contain. But Gravano's story, as significant as it is, has become distorted over time. A broader misconception has taken root, one that involves other mafia figures, other cases, and other decades entirely. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. Gravano's second fall proved that breaking Omerta did not make him a different man. But the bigger misconception is not about what Gravano became. It is about who else supposedly testified against Gotti, and why that popular claim does not hold up to the actual record. Part 5. The Myth of Other Bosses. A claim has circulated for years in documentaries, online forums, and casual retellings of the Gotti story. According to this version, multiple mafia bosses testified against him. The narrative suggests a dramatic collapse of loyalty across the entire mafia structure. Boss after boss stepping forward to cooperate, each one adding their own testimony to the case that brought Gotti down. The image is compelling. A wave of betrayal from the top ranks of organized crime, crashing over the most powerful boss in America. The verified record does not support that image. Only one boss-level figure testified at John Gotti's 1992 trial. One. The sole boss-level cooperator was Salvatore Gravano. As underboss, he held the highest rank of any witness in the case. No official boss of another New York family took the stand. No head of the Bonanno family, the Colombo family, the Lucchese family, or the Genovese family appeared as a government witness. The case that convicted John Gotti rested on Gravano's testimony, combined with the FBI's wiretap recordings. That was the prosecution's core. That was what produced the verdict. The distinction matters. Within the mafia's hierarchy, the boss holds the top position. The underboss is directly beneath. Gravano's rank was extraordinarily high, and his cooperation was unprecedented at the time. But he was technically the number 2 in the organization, not the number 1. No sitting boss of any New York family cooperated with the government in connection with Gotti's trial. The confusion comes from events that occurred in entirely separate cases, often years or decades later. The cooperators who came later were real. Their connection to the Gotti trial was not. Michael DiLeonardo, a captain in the Gambino crime family, is often mentioned in connection with the Gotti case. DiLeonardo did cooperate with the government, and his testimony was significant. As a captain, he held a rank below the underboss, but above the soldiers and associates at the lower tiers of the organization. His knowledge of the Gambino family's operations was extensive, and his decision to cooperate provided the government with valuable intelligence. But his cooperation was part of a separate proceeding. Different charges, different defendants, different years. He did not testify at Gotti's 1992 trial. Joseph Massino, the boss of the Bonanno crime family, is the other figure most frequently cited. Massino's cooperation was genuinely historic. When he flipped in 2004, he became the first official sitting boss of a New York family to become a government witness. That distinction made his case a landmark in organized crime prosecution. His cooperation had real and lasting consequences for the Bonanno family and for the Mafia's structure in New York. But Massino flipped in 2004. Gotti was convicted in April of 1992. 12 years separate those events. Different defendants, different charges, different legal proceedings. Massino did not testify at Gotti's trial. The connection between the two cases is thematic. Both involved high-ranking mafia figures cooperating with the government, but not factual. They are separate chapters in the history of organized crime, separated by more than a decade of time. 12 years, different cases, different courtrooms. The timelines are not even close. The blurring of these timelines is partly a function of how media covers organized crime. Documentaries and retrospective analyses present the broader arc of Mafia decline as a continuous narrative. Events that occurred years apart get compressed into a single storyline. Figures who cooperated in separate decades appear alongside one another, creating the impression they were part of the same wave of defections. The compression serves a storytelling purpose. It makes the decline feel unified and dramatic, but it distorts the historical record. There is also a psychological component. The idea of multiple bosses turning on Gotti satisfies a narrative expectation. In popular storytelling, a powerful figure is brought down by a coalition of enemies, not by a single betrayal. The notion that one underboss, acting alone, could destroy the most powerful mafia boss in America feels disproportionate to some audiences. A version of the story in which multiple bosses cooperated feels more proportional to the scale of the outcome. That instinct, the desire for a story that matches its ending, drives the misconception forward even without factual support. The internet has amplified the effect considerably. Online discussions, video essays, and social media posts repeat the claim without verification. Once a piece of misinformation circulates widely enough, it acquires a kind of cultural authority that is difficult to correct. The claim that multiple bosses testified against Gotti has become one of those persistent inaccuracies that survives through repetition rather than evidence. Each retelling reinforces the last, and the myth solidifies further with every cycle. The actual record is more surgical than the myth. One man, one decision, one act of cooperation from the right position within the organization. That was enough. The Mafia's structure was not brought down by a coalition. It was brought down by a single point of failure at the top. One underboss who recognized that the loyalty he had given was not being returned. And the consequences of that recognition did not stop at the courtroom doors. The myth says a wave of bosses brought Gotti down, but the reality, that one man from one seat was enough, is exactly what made the aftermath so devastating for every family that survived. Part 6. The Shockwave Through Organized Crime. On the evening of April 2nd, 1992, the news traveled through every level of organized crime in New York within hours. Phone calls between captains, messages passed through intermediaries, associates checking in with their crews. The details of the verdict moved through the 5 families faster than any newspaper or broadcast could carry them. And the detail that landed hardest was not the conviction itself. It was who had made it possible. The underboss. The number 2. The man who had been in the room for every major decision the Gambino family had made in nearly a decade. The immediate consequence was paranoia, not the general low-level suspicion that had always existed between criminal associates, but a structural, corrosive distrust that reached into every level of every family. Captains looked at their soldiers differently. Bosses looked at their underbosses differently. The person sitting across the table at any meeting might be cooperating already. The person answering the phone might be recording the call. The entire operational foundation of organized crime, built on the assumption that insiders would never betray the organization, was now unreliable. After Gravano, every member of every family had to answer the same question. Who around them might be next? The behavioral changes came quickly. Internal communications became guarded. Decision-making became more insulated. Leaders shrank the circle of people who had access to sensitive information. The free-flowing discussions that Gotti had conducted at the Ravenite Social Club, the kind of open, regular meetings where business was discussed in detail, became relics. Bosses stopped speaking openly. They stopped meeting in predictable locations. They stopped trusting that the people around them would stay silent. The changes were not limited to communication. The way families structured their operations shifted fundamentally. Captains received less visibility into what other crews were doing. Information flowed on a need-to-know basis rather than through the hierarchy. Orders were passed through intermediaries rather than delivered directly. The organizational model that had made the 5 families efficient, a clear chain of command with open communication between levels, was replaced by a fragmented structure in which no single person below the boss had a complete picture of the page. Families' operations. These changes made the families harder for law enforcement to penetrate from the outside, but they also made the organizations less cohesive, less efficient, and less capable of the coordinated criminal enterprises that had once made them dominant. The Mafia's historical power came from its ability to coordinate across a wide network, controlling construction contracts, managing labor unions, running waste management operations across entire regions. That coordination required communication and trust between members at multiple levels. The post-1992 Paranoia made that coordination progressively more difficult. The Mafia became more secretive after 1992, but secrecy built on paranoia is not the same as secrecy built on trust. In the years that followed, the rate of high-level cooperation with the federal government increased steadily. More captains agreed to testify, more associates provided information. In the most dramatic cases, additional bosses followed the path Gravano had opened. Joseph Massino's decision to cooperate in 2004 was the most prominent example, but it was part of a broader trend. Each new cooperator lowered the psychological barrier for the next one. Each case proved that the government could protect its witnesses and deliver on its promises of reduced sentences. The effect was cumulative. When one captain cooperated and received a reduced sentence, other captains facing similar charges took notice. When a boss cooperated and survived, physically survived, meaning the Mafia did not succeed in killing him, other bosses in legal jeopardy had a model to follow. The cascade was slow but steady. With each new cooperator, the government gained more intelligence, more evidence, and more leverage to secure additional cooperation. The process fed itself. Federal prosecutors used this momentum aggressively. The RICO statute, designed to target criminal organizations at the leadership level, became exponentially more effective when combined with insider testimony. Each cooperating witness provided information that led to additional investigations, additional indictments, additional convictions. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Every cooperation made the next one more likely. Each cooperator made the next one more likely. The cycle of betrayal fed on itself. Beyond the legal consequences, the Gotti conviction accelerated a decline that had been building for years in specific industries. The Gambino family's grip on the concrete industry in New York, which had allowed them to collect payments on virtually every major construction project in the city, weakened as federal oversight increased and contractors found it safer to refuse cooperation than to continue paying. The family's influence in the Fulton fish market, which had been a Gambino revenue source for decades, was dismantled through a combination of federal prosecution and civil RICO actions. The garment district operations, the waste hauling cartels, the union locals, each of these revenue streams came under intensified pressure in the years following the conviction, as prosecutors used the Gotti template to go after the captains and associates who had managed those operations. After his conviction, that model of leadership disappeared. The bosses who followed Gotti retreated into the kind of anonymity that had characterized organized crime leadership before his rise. They avoided public appearances. They kept their names out of the press. They conducted business away from known locations. The glamour that had surrounded the figure of the Mafia boss faded into memory, replaced by a quieter, more cautious form of criminal leadership. Future bosses understood the lesson Gotti's career had taught. Public visibility was not armor, it was a target. The lesson extended beyond personal behavior. The entire culture of Mafia leadership shifted. Where bosses had once gathered regularly at social clubs, now meetings were rare and carefully controlled. Where families had once operated with a degree of openness among their own members, now information was compartmentalized to the point where captains in the same family might have no knowledge of each other's operations. The internal architecture of organized crime bent under the weight of distrust, and it never straightened back out. families became more selective about recruitment. The process of vetting new members grew more rigorous as the fear of future cooperators shaped every decision. Smaller, tighter organizations replaced the sprawling networks of the earlier era. The contraction was a survival strategy, but it came at the cost of the reach, the coordination, and the influence that had defined the five families at their peak. The Mafia's power had historically come from its size and its ability to coordinate across wide networks of members and associates. Smaller organizations were harder to penetrate, but they were also less capable of the broad criminal enterprises that had once dominated construction, labor unions, and waste management in New York. John Gotti remained in federal prison for the rest of his life. He passed away from throat cancer on June 10, 2002, at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. He was 61 years old. He had spent the final 10 years of his life inside a federal facility, separated from the family he had led, the public life he had cultivated, and the world he had once believed he controlled completely. His death was a quiet end for a man whose entire public career had been defined by visibility and spectacle. The boss who had once stood on the steps of a Manhattan courthouse, surrounded by cameras and supporters, died in a medical facility attached to a federal prison. There was no public ceremony of the kind that had once marked the passing of Mafia leaders in earlier decades. The era that Gotti had represented, the era of the celebrity crime boss, ended in the same institution that had confined him for the final decade of his life. The boss, who once stood on courthouse steps surrounded by cameras, died in a prison medical ward. He was 61. The Gambino family continued to exist after Gotti's imprisonment and death, but in diminished form. Successive leaders operated with far less authority than Gotti had commanded. The family's influence in both legitimate and illegitimate enterprises declined steadily through the 1990s and 2000s. Federal prosecutions continued to target its leadership. The willingness of members to cooperate with the government continued to increase. The family that Gotti had once run as the most visible criminal organization in America became smaller, quieter, and weaker with each passing year. The other four families experienced similar trajectories, though the specifics varied. The Bonanno family was eventually led by Joseph Massino, who became the first sitting boss of any New York family to cooperate, 12 years after Gravano had set the precedent as an underboss. The Colombo family endured internal wars that further weakened its structure. The Lucchese and Genovese families survived longer by maintaining the secrecy that Gotti had abandoned. But even they could not escape the accelerating wave of federal prosecutions that followed the 1992 template. Across all five families, the pattern was consistent. Increased cooperators, leading to increased convictions, leading to decreased operational capability. The cycle that Gravano had started did not stop with the Gambino family. It moved through every organization in turn. The broader structure of the American Mafia was permanently altered by what happened in 1992. The five families of New York did not disappear. They adapted, they restructured, they continued to operate. But the model of the untouchable boss, commanding absolute loyalty, operating above the reach of law enforcement, protected by a code of silence that no one would break, was finished. The Gotti case proved that no one was beyond prosecution, and that the very people a boss trusted most could become the instruments of his destruction. Organized crime in the United States did not end with Gotti's conviction. Criminal organizations continued to function in various forms, adapting to increased law enforcement pressure and the erosion of the old loyalty structures. But the organizations that survived looked nothing like the ones that had existed before 1992. They were smaller, they were quieter, they were more fragmented, and they operated under a constant awareness that had not existed in the earlier era. The awareness that the person sitting next to them might, at any moment, decide that cooperation with the government was a better option than loyalty to the family. That awareness changed everything about how the Mafia functioned, and it never went away. For law enforcement, the Gotti case established a template that would be used for the next 3 decades. Electronic surveillance, combined with cooperating insider testimony, build the evidence base. Turn the insider, Let the tapes and the testimony reinforce each other. Case after case through the 1990s and 2000s followed that same structure. It worked every time, because Gravano had proven it could work. The template was effective precisely because it addressed the two challenges that had always made organized crime prosecution difficult. The first was evidentiary, getting evidence that could survive cross-examination and jury skepticism. Wiretaps solved that by providing the defendant's own voice. The second was narrative, helping a jury understand how a criminal organization functioned, who gave orders, and how those orders were carried out. Cooperating witnesses solved that by providing the context that transformed raw recordings into a coherent story of criminal enterprise. Before 1992, those two elements had never been combined successfully in a case against a sitting New York Mafia boss. After 1992, the combination became standard practice. The Gotti case did not just convict one man. It created the blueprint that federal prosecutors would use to dismantle organized crime leadership for decades to come. The method was applied not only in New York, but across every major city where organized crime maintained a presence: Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, New England. Each successful prosecution reinforced the template. Each conviction made it harder for the next boss to convince his subordinates that silence was still the safest option. The acceleration of RICO cases against organized crime in the 1990s and 2000s traces directly to the precedent established by the Gotti trial. Before 1992, prosecutors had limited success turning high-ranking members. After 1992, the landscape shifted permanently. The conviction proved that even the most powerful boss could be brought down through cooperation. That proof had a measurable effect on the willingness of future defendants to consider deals with the government. The most significant change was invisible to anyone outside the organizations. Before 1992, a mafia member's daily life was defined by routine, regular meetings, established hierarchies, predictable social interactions within the family. After 1992, that routine was gone. Members avoided gathering in groups. Phone conversations became shorter and more guarded. Long-standing social traditions within the families, the dinners, the holiday gatherings, the celebrations that had reinforced bonds between members, were curtailed or abandoned entirely. The Mafia had always been, at its core, a social organization. The paranoia that followed Gravano's cooperation made that social dimension a liability rather than a strength. It never stopped spreading. Today, the American Mafia still exists. Federal law enforcement continues to bring cases against organized crime figures in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New England. Indictments are still handed down. Members are still arrested, but the organizations named in those indictments bear little resemblance to the families that existed before 1992. The bosses are unknown to the public, the operations are smaller, the revenue streams are narrower, and the internal relationships that hold these organizations together are strained by the permanent knowledge that cooperation with the government is not just possible, it is common. Gravano's decision in 1991 did not end the Mafia. It ended the version of the Mafia that believed it could not be broken from the inside. Everything that followed, the paranoia, the additional cooperators, the accelerated prosecutions, the collapse of public Mafia glamour, flows from that single fracture point. The code of silence held for generations. It took one man from one seat to prove it could not hold forever. One betrayal was all it took, and its consequences have never stopped. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what happened to every Mafia boss who testified against John Gotti, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.